Hi, welcome or welcome back. I'm Dom and I have been reading books. I have not been talking about the books I've been reading, but I have been reading them. So it is time to do my winter wrap up and talk about all of the books that I have read from January to the end of March. I mean, technically I feel like you can count December in that, but I read like 17 books in December. I don't know what I was on, but I was like getting them. And I'm not including those 17 books. This video would be like 40 minutes long and we're not trying for that. So let's just talk about the books that we've read this year thus far. So I don't know what it is. I used to be a paper book only type of girl, but ever since I got this Kindle, game over. I haven't been reading paper books. I think I've read 5 paper books out of the 18 books that I've read. That's bad. And I've listened to like 7 audiobooks. Like I've been heavy on the Kindle and audiobooks. And you know what? It's working. It's getting me the books I need to be reading. So let's not complain. But let's jump into it. The first book that I read at the start of the year was Sunny Disposition, The Mendel Hawks book number 1 by Deanna Gray. I've only read one sports romance in general, so this was my first hockey romance, and I have to say, I don't get the hype. Maybe it's because hockey wasn't like a huge point of this story. It was more so just like something that existed in the background, and maybe I need to see something that makes hockey players more hockey-ish. I don't know. I don't know what it's about. I personally don't think the sports aspect adds anything to the story. But with that said, this book was so cute. It followed a gamer girl and a hockey player guy as they not only try and reconnect with each other after something happened, but as them being roommates. And I wouldn't say it's like enemies to lovers, but it is definitely grumpy sunshine. Like she got the vibe that he didn't like her and he just was not able to communicate any other emotion other than like a harumph. like just a general moodiness to the entire existence. But at the same time that I was reading that, I was listening to the audiobook Gurl, Gurl, Gurl on womanhood and something else. And I'm trying to read more nonfiction, so that's part of the reason I chose this book. And it was like a collection of essays from women about what it means to be a Black woman in this world. And I thought that every single one of them offered a different perspective upon which to kind of dissect. And it went through like being a woman, like a young woman, to being a mother, and the Black Lives Matter movement and how impactful that was for women who were raising Black sons and the fear that existed. And it also talked a little bit about the mistreatment of Black women within the medical industry and how our pain and our suffering and our symptoms aren't taken as seriously because of the negative effect of the strong Black woman. My camera died, that's why I'm in a different like angle and everything like that. What I thought was really interesting is that it was from women who were living in the UK. Like a few of them were American and they chose to move to the UK because they thought it would bring them better living. But it was definitely about their experience as being Black women in a different country. And I thought that was different because even as a Canadian, a lot of how we view racism is through the American lens and how Black people have it in America. So to take that outside of that country and show that these problems still exist for Black people all around the world, I thought that was a great layer to add to the overall experience, like the overall story they were telling about Black women in this world. Now next, the first book that I read that was a paper book, and I purchased it because not only did I want to support a fellow Canadian author, but I wanted to own a physical copy of this fantasy novel because it is the first of its kind that I would own. The majority of the fantasy novels that I own are by white women talking about mostly white characters, and I know that's not where fantasy ends. So I'm definitely trying to find different books, specifically fae books, about characters outside of whiteness. And this is why I cannot recommend this book enough. A Broken Blade? This book slapped. It was so good. If you love Sarah J. Maas's Thorn of Glass, read this. This is like the better, more diverse version of that story. So it follows Kira, who is the king's assassin, because all halfling women have to work as a part of this like guild where they have to fight and kill on behalf of the king. And so Kira is the best of those bitches. Even though she has her own problems and is not top of her game all of the time, she is still the number one bitch of that clan. And that is why she's the king's assassin. I don't know why I'm saying it like it's a good thing, because I like personally would not want to be the king's assassin. But she uses it not only as a tool to do better, but to shape the world eventually. So it follows her journey from being the king's assassin to kind of finding herself again. So she made this promise that she would try and like do better to this person that she loved. And she forgot that promise for a very long time. And while tracking her nemesis, per se, she ends up finding herself again. Now, the representation. I have a little chart that I created on Google Sheets of like to track the different diverse reads that I read, and like if the author is white, if the author is black, if the author is a she, if the author is a he or they. And I had to create a separate category because this had so much diversity in it. Not only is it from the point of view of Indigenous women dealing with the effects of colonization, but it also has LGBTQ diversity, and it has a plus size character, and it has black people. It has just all types of different perspectives. And so if you are looking for a good fantasy book with a romance subplot. Now, granted, the romance is a very much so a subplot. Like, I would not categorize this as a romantasy at all, because you don't see things get going in the first book. But there is a romance subplot. If you love that, if you love revolution, if you love seeing people who had to deal with the negative effects of colonization rise up and kick some ass, this book right here, you got to read this book right here. So this, I don't know if I'm being too hard. I don't know if it's because I'm just not really feeling reading this year, but this was only 4.5 stars for me. There was nothing that I would necessarily improve upon. I just didn't obsess over it the way I wanted to obsess over it. But that did not mean I didn't love this. And that doesn't mean I don't think everybody should read this, because it takes all the aspects that you love in a lot of the popular fantasy novels, and it gives it to us through the lens of brown people. And we need that. I need that. So I definitely ran and ate this book up. And of course, because I love that book so much, I ended up getting the second book in the series, which is A Shadow Crown, which just continues the journey of Kira as she's kind of moving from just being the king's assassin to being something that you could really root for. Now, the third book just came out this year. I just haven't read it yet. I needed a break after the cliffhanger of this one. Like, this one, I'm not going to say I didn't see it coming. There's a lot of the story that I wouldn't say is predictable, but it's easy to guess at. But it was still heartbreaking. And it's still going to have you in your feels, and it's still going to make you want to continue and read more. But I just wouldn't say that you would be surprised by what happens in this book. And the next one I did was The Grim Reaper's Lawyer. I've heard a lot of hype about this book within the Black community, and a lot of people enjoy this story, and I have to say I get it. I get it. It's about this lawyer who dies, and because she's a lawyer, she's destined to go to hell. And so she's given the choice to either represent a Grim Reaper in court or continue her journey to hell. And she decides to represent the Grim Reaper. The character Aiden, the Grim Reaper, not only is he the hottest thing walking, but his, like, attitude is so hot. And it shouldn't be, because I would be so irritated if I were in her position. But his attitude is definitely good girl vibes. Like, you know, those type of guys who are like, you know, if you know, you know. Not only is it like a paranormal romance, but it's also a mystery as she's trying to solve what happened to cause the Grim Reaper to be on trial. I enjoyed this book, but I would definitely say this book pissed me off because there was certain points of it where it was blaringly obvious who the bad guy was, and like from chapter 3, and so you're just irritated for like 10 to 15 chapters while you're waiting for them to also figure out who the bad guy is. Like, I'm not good at guessing, and I guessed like day 1 who the problem child is. And I don't get how they didn't get that. But there were a few twists and turns at the end that I didn't see coming, so I do appreciate that. The next book was on audiobook, and that's I Don't Need Therapy. If this book taught me anything, it's that I can't just read random memoirs. I'm not going to lie to you. I should have known it was a memoir. I don't know what I thought it was when I started it, but I listened to it, and the entire time, I couldn't figure out why I was supposed to care. And I think the problem with that is I didn't know who this person was, so their story wasn't important to me. And I also didn't get their sense of humor, so it wasn't as funny as I think it was supposed to be for me. So I just can't read memoirs by people I don't know. And I think that's like, I don't know, is that a normal thing? Like, can you read anybody's memoir? Not to say it wasn't good, it just wasn't for me. And I'm not going to rate it because I don't rate memoirs. Those are people's personal stories. They're not like writing a book that has things that you can judge, like style and character development and plot. This is just like them talking about their lives. But I definitely didn't care about her life, which, that's fair. I shouldn't have read it. But I learned a lesson there today. I can't just read anything I want. So next, this book I have seen everywhere. It is like huge in the Black community. So I've been waiting to read it for a long time, and that's Only for the Weak by Natasha Bishop. I don't know who doesn't love this book, and I would definitely have a conversation with them about why, because this book was amazing. Now, I recently made a TikTok asking what type of guys do romance readers like. Do you like a perfect man or do you like a flawed man? Like this, so this man on top of another man from a different book made me realize that I'm not a fan of perfect men because he was too good, which is not a problem. I think that women deserve men that are too good. I think with everything we've been through and everything we still have to go through, I think women deserve perfect men. But in a story, I don't like perfect men. So that's the only reason this book wasn't a 5-star read for me, because Rome in Only for the Weak by Natasha Bishop, he was perfect. There was not a single thing wrong with him. He did everything right, which is great. It's just not for me. But it follows, so let me talk about the story. Natasha Bishop, Only for the Weak, follows a girl whose sister is marrying her ex-boyfriend. Why we do this trope, I do not know. Because I would be throwing hands whether I love that man or not. You are not stealing my boyfriend if you are related to me or you are my best friend. You're not. I don't care. But yeah, her sister is getting married to her ex-boyfriend and has the nerve to ask her to be in the wedding. So of course she has to go. And his best friend, Rome, who has always had a thing for her, and has stayed away from her because of that, because he's not like the sister or the man. He is going there and realizing that he can finally pursue his feelings for her. So they make a deal that they're going to only be with each other for the week, hence the title. Now, the entire time he's trying to prove to her why it should be more than that, and she's kind of going through her own stuff. So the thing I will praise about this story is that it was still interesting without having a third act breakup. And it still made me love the characters. I just think that I need somebody who has a little bit more layers for me to really love them, because I personally would get bored with somebody who is just great all the time. But with that said, this was a 4.5 read. It was damn near perfect, and it was so good for the short, like 260 pages that it is. The next story that I read is a nonfiction finance book, so I'm not going to really talk much about it, but it is Financial Feminist by Tori Dunlap. She runs her first 100K website and talks about building wealth as a woman living in a society where you are undervalued compared to white men. And she does talk a little bit about sectionality and how even as a white woman, she has more privilege than, for saying, me or a person who's a part of the LGBTQ community, and ways that we can try and not only support each other through the financial things we invest in, but how we can bypass these limitations to try and become millionaires. I liked this book. It didn't teach me a lot more than what I didn't already know, other than about index funds, which I wasn't aware of. But I think if you don't have an understanding of money, this is a great book to start with, because it breaks things down like budgeting and debt and investment, and it kind of creates this path for you to follow to get to a financially independent lifestyle. But enough about that. Another Fae book that is diverse AF is Faebound. This book came out this year, and I would say run, don't walk to read it, because not only is this a great fantasy novel with a lot of political intrigue and world building, but it's also one of those diverse reads that everybody could kind of see themselves in. So I really love that aspect of the story, and it wasn't used in a way where it felt like clickbaity, where they were just adding it to add it. It was definitely a part of the world that they were creating to show how things exist for them and their people. But the story follows two sisters. One of them is banished from their land because she did something that resulted in a lot of people's deaths, and her sister follows her to try and get her to come back home, or to figure out how they can do it, because you can't really survive outside of the region where the few clans exist, because there's not much out there. So she goes out into this world, and not only does she discover that there is more out there, but that what's out there could be the end of the reason that these clans are constantly fighting each other. And it's just a great story. So finally, people have been talking about this book non-stop, and I read The Perfect Find by this author, and I loved that book. It was a 5-star read for me. It was a 5-star read for me. So why not read the book that they are most known for, which is 7 Days in June. It has everything I love in a romance. It has flawed characters with strong development. It has other subplots that add to their overall growth, and it has a connection that you can feel through the pages. That was my first 5-star read of the year, and I can't wait to read her book that just came out, A Love Song for Ricky Wilde, because every book she writes is 5 stars. Now the next book I read pissed me off. I have not been this mad at a book in a long time, and that is In Every Mirror She's Black. I don't even really want to talk about it because it was just so infuriating. I don't like reading books where it's just watching Black women struggle. I don't like reading books where I don't see a point to their strife. But this could just be a me thing, because I don't read a lot of fiction, like contemporary fiction or any type of fiction that's like this. So I might not understand what I'm supposed to take away from it, because I'm very dense and I only see what's in front of me. Like, I'm not good at dissecting writing to find underlying things. So for me, this was just a story about 3 Black women having messed up lives. And the way it ended did not change my opinion of the book. If anything, it made me hate it more. I do think it's well written, and I wouldn't say that people shouldn't read it. Like, I don't think it's offensive. It's just not the type of story that I would read on a normal basis, it's just not the type of story that I enjoy, and so I couldn't get into it, really. But yeah, there's a sequel, and I don't know how there's a sequel based off of how it ended, and I don't know if there's a point to a sequel. But maybe by the second book, it gets better. I don't know if you liked it. Tell me what you liked, and maybe you can change my mind. I've been trying to read Black classics since February. It's not going well. I've only read one, and that one is If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. And I have to say, I'm enjoying it. I didn't think I was a classics person because I tried reading The Picture of Dorian Gray, and the first page was one sentence, and it lost me like half, not even, like 3 parts into the sentence, I was gone. And so I was like, if this is classics, I don't know if I'm a classics person. But like, before I tap out of books that weren't written in the last like 10 to 20 years, let me try and read a book by a Black author and see if I feel differently about it. And I get why James Baldwin is James Baldwin, because his writing is powerful. And I think it's so interesting that even in our literature from like 50 years ago, we've been talking about how Black Lives Matter. And James Baldwin is standing 10 toes down in this story about the impacts of not only police brutality, but of racism in the judicial system. And so I think that more so than even Black people, white people should be reading this story. So to realize the severity that's been existing inside of America since the beginning of time, and how we're not just talking about it now, it's just being recorded now. But with that said, I don't know if I'm a historical reader, because there was points where people were doing some stuff and I'm like, this is definitely not okay. And they were like, this guy's a great guy. And I'm like, agree to disagree. So I don't know if I could read books written before we realized that certain things weren't okay. Because like, I understand that that's how they existed back then. But just because I can understand that, no, because you should know better at any time. You should have known better. These things should have never, like, these things were never okay. And I'm trying to understand that, like, the concept of that wasn't as strong as it is now. But with that said, I'm still not going to like the character. Another book that kind of made me mad was Blood Like Magic. I have never been so frustrated with a character, and I don't know if I was supposed to be, but Voya Thomas, can you come to the front of the congregation? Because I would like to have a few words with you. So this story follows Voya Thomas, who's a witch in Toronto from a very powerful rich family. When they get their period, they have to go through this journey where their ancestor gives them a challenge that they have to pass in order to get their magic. Voya fails that challenge, and so her ancestor offers her a second chance, but on the grounds that if she fails that second chance, her whole family will lose their magic. And her task is to destroy her first love. There's nothing I can say without giving the story away, but I will say this: if Voya Thomas was related to me and my life was in her hands, we would have been fighting. We would have had problems. But yeah. See, I'm doing so good. These aren't just romances that I'm reading. I've read like 4 fantasies so far. So we're definitely stepping outside of our comfort zone. This is my second 5-star read of the year, and I think that says enough about this story. But if you need to know more, this story follows Soledad as she goes on a journey about rediscovering herself after an awful marriage. And if you're not a huge romance person, like if romance is not a genre that you typically read, you can still read this book and get a lot out of it, because it's more of a woman's fiction than I would say it is of a romance. The romance was very much so a subplot to the general story that we went on. This next book was a book club pick for one of the writing groups I'm in, and this is why I don't join book clubs. It's a fragile enchantment. And I have never been so like flabbergasted by someone's lack of interest in the betterness of their own people than I have in this story. So the main character is like a magical tailor. She can use her magic because most of the people in this world have magic, and she can specifically use hers to weave emotions into clothes. And because of that, this king from another country wants her to come and make the wardrobe for his brother's wedding to another country's princess. And his country, so to just sum up what my problem with the story is, his country, the king's country, is pretty much England, right? The girl's country, where the tailor lives, is pretty much Ireland. England, as in history, really screwed over Ireland, caused a giant famine and everything. And she comes to be in this country of England and has no, and like her dad died from this war that they had, and she has no ill feelings towards this royal family at all, to the point that the main love interest is the prince who's getting married. There is no way that with the way that her country was treated, that in her right mind, she would fall in love with the prince of the country who did it. That's it. That's my whole beef with this story. She just didn't give a single care about her family, to the point where grandma was like, don't do it, or don't even go there. That's how much I dislike them. Don't even go help them for their wedding. I'm not the most knowledgeable about the history between England and Ireland, but I know enough to know that this story probably shouldn't have been written this way. And I get it's like an enemies to lovers, but I couldn't do an enemies to lovers like this and root for the relationship. So the next book I read was a fantasy book, and it was really hyped up because it was originally going to be indie published, but after the release of the cover, it got so much attention that the author ended up getting a traditionally published deal, and now her story is released not only in America but in the UK as well, and that's Lore of the Wilds. So if you haven't noticed yet, my favorite type of fantasy books have fae in them, and this book is no different. So this book follows Lore, who's a human who has to live in this specific village for humans only because they're just kind of despised by the fae. But one day somebody comes and takes her and brings her to this library in the Fae Kingdom, the Light Fae Kingdom, because nobody of Fae descent can enter the library without dying. So they need somebody who is not Fae, but who can also read their language to go in and try and find any books of importance. So she goes in and she ends up finding a book that is really important. And instead of turning it over, she keeps it for herself, thus beginning an entire journey. The journey that we went on in this story wasn't as exciting as I thought it was gonna be, and I don't know if that's because I was just learning how everything worked. And there were certain parts where it felt very rushed, and I didn't understand why this particularly had to happen. So it was like a whiplash. Some parts were really slow, some parts were really rushed, and I think overall it could have been smoothed out to be an experience that had the same stakes throughout. Like I said, for more fae books with representation, then this would be a good book to read as well. And if you're new into the fantasy genre, this one has light world building and easy storyline to follow. So it's not overcomplicated. There's not a lot of characters and there's not a lot of things happening that you have to feel like you're focusing on a lot. It's very smooth and more romantasy than fantasy. My mouth is dry. So that is the 18 books I read this winter. I feel like for the most part, it's been good this year. There's not been anything I flat out hated. There have been a few DNFs, but I don't really count them as DNFs because I DNF'd them within the first chapter. It was just more so I can tell already by the first few sentences that I am not in the mood to read this story. So I'm not judging the book based off of that. It's just I didn't feel like it's just very much so being a mood reader. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.